Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into some malicious compliance stories. Today we've got 3 tales of people who ignored warnings, refused to pay, and treated staff like they didn't matter until reality caught up. One involves a building manager who denied overtime over a pipe and watched a hallway flood, another 2 tourists who bulldozed their way onto a night walk and scared away the wildlife, and the last a pub owner who cut wages and watched her multi-million-pound investment empty out. Here we go. They thought I'd shrug off a broken promise over 15 cents. Back in 2006, I worked as a maintenance technician in a small 3-story office building. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady and honest. My job was simple in theory: make sure everything worked. That meant keeping the air conditioning humming in summer, the heating steady in winter, the plumbing flowing, and the electrical panels from doing anything dramatic. If something broke, I fixed it. If something looked like it might break, I fixed it before it did. Most of the tenants barely knew I existed, which was exactly how maintenance should be. When no one notices you, it means nothing's on fire. For years, we had a building manager who trusted us. If I said a pump needed replacing or a valve needed attention, he signed off without theatrics. Then corporate decided we needed fresh leadership and sent us a new boss from headquarters. He arrived in a crisp suit and immediately started talking about efficiency metrics and cost controls. By the end of his first week, he gathered the maintenance and admin staff into the conference room. He stood at the head of the table and said very clearly, "From now on, absolutely no overtime. No matter what, no exceptions." We all exchanged looks. I can remember thinking he had to be testing us. Buildings don't operate on a neat 9-to-5 schedule. Pipes don't check the clock before bursting. But he was serious. Plan better, he added. Anything that can wait until regular hours waits. That Friday around 4:30 in the afternoon, I got an alert from the boiler room. One of the main water lines feeding the heating system was showing pressure readings that made my stomach tighten. I went downstairs to check it in person. The pipe wasn't just warm, it was vibrating. Not subtly either. It was shuddering against its brackets like it was trying to escape the wall. I've been around enough systems to know when something's about to fail. That pipe was not planning to have a peaceful weekend. I traced the issue to a faulty pressure release valve. It wasn't a massive job, 1 to 2 hours tops, and we'd be safe. I wiped my hands, checked the time, and walked upstairs to the boss's office. "This pipe is dangerous," I told him plainly. "Pressure's too high. I need maybe an hour or 2 of overtime tonight to swap the valve and bleed the system." He glanced at the clock on his desk. "It's almost 5. "Yes," I said. "That's why I'm here." He leaned back in his chair. "No overtime. We'll handle it Monday." I stared at him for a moment to make sure he understood. "It may not wait until Monday." He shrugged. "It's just a pipe." "All right," I said evenly. "Your call." "You warned him, clear as day." He looked at the clock, looked at you, and decided a pipe with dangerous pressure could wait. "You clocked out at 5. That's not negligence. That's just following orders." I clocked out at 5 sharp and went home. Saturday morning around 8 a.m. my phone rang. It was the weekend security guard, and he sounded like he was on the verge of hyperventilating. "There's water everywhere," he yelled. "The boiler room is flooding. It's coming into the hallway." I sat up in bed and closed my eyes for a second. "Did you shut off the main valve?" I asked. "I tried. It's already soaked down there. What do I do?" I couldn't help it. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was inevitable. At this point, nothing. You can't fix a rupture with a mop. Call the boss. By the time I arrived at the building, the damage was already done. The pipe had ruptured sometime overnight, water had sprayed across the boiler room, seeped into the adjacent hallway, and pooled under the ground floor offices. Carpet squished under my boots. Ceiling tiles were sagging. The smell of wet insulation hung in the air like a warning label. IT equipment that had been stored in a ground floor room was sitting in shallow water. Filing cabinets had wicked moisture up into stacks of paper. There was no containing it anymore. The boss showed up an hour later in loafers that were not designed for puddles. He took one look at the hallway and turned a shade of red that matched the exit signs. "What happened?" he demanded. I kept my tone neutral. The pipe we discussed yesterday failed. He pointed at the water-stained walls. "Why didn't you stop this?" I met his eyes. "You told me no overtime, no exceptions." I needed 1 or 2 hours. The pipe didn't want to wait until Monday. For a second, he opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. There wasn't much to say. The security log showed the time of the rupture. My maintenance notes from Friday documented the pressure readings and my recommendation. Cleanup crews were called in. Industrial fans ran for days. Carpets had to be ripped out. A chunk of drywall was replaced. IT filed insurance claims for damaged equipment. Tenants complained loudly. The total cost, let's just say it was significantly more than 2 hours of overtime. Monday afternoon, the boss called another meeting. This time his tone was less commanding. If maintenance flags an issue, he said carefully, handle it. Do what you have to do. I raised an eyebrow. Even if it runs past 5? He hesitated. Yes, just handle it. From that day forward, he never once denied an overtime request. In fact, if we mentioned something even remotely concerning, he'd wave a hand and say, take care of it. Don't surprise me later. The building ran smoother after that. We fixed small problems before they became expensive disasters, and he learned something that most maintenance guys already know. Systems don't care about budget meetings. Sometimes it takes a flooded hallway and a stack of ruined paperwork to understand that prevention is cheaper than pride. And sometimes the best instructor in a room is a pipe that refuses to wait until Monday. He learned his lesson the expensive way. 2 hours of overtime would have cost maybe $100. Instead, he got ruined carpet, damaged equipment, and a whole building full of angry tenants. That pipe taught him more about maintenance than any efficiency seminar ever could. And our second story. The judge has standards. 2 entitled tourists failed them. My family's always been big on traveling together. At least once a year, we plan a trip that includes grandparents, siblings, spouses, and kids. A few years ago, my mom mentioned she'd always wanted to go to Belize. And that was all it took. We started researching immediately, looking at reefs, ruins, and wildlife preserves like it was just another exciting family adventure. Then she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Treatment started quickly and everything shifted. Chemo appointments replaced planning meetings and hospital waiting rooms replaced travel guides. Through it all, though, that Belize trip stayed on the calendar. It became her finish line, something bright and real at the end of months of exhausting treatment. This past spring, we finally made it happen. We built the entire itinerary around her stamina and comfort level, choosing excursions that could accommodate a slower pace. We snorkeled the Blue Hole with guides who made sure she didn't feel rushed. We explored Mayan ruins with frequent breaks and shaded rest stops. And we went cave tubing on a route that didn't require steep climbs. The final stretch of the trip was at a remote eco-lodge in the middle of a massive wildlife preserve spanning hundreds of thousands of acres. The place was known for bird watching and sightings of jaguars, pumas, ocelots, and other big cats. They offered guided night and early morning walks, but group sizes were strictly limited for safety reasons. That actually worked perfectly for us because my mom needed smaller, slower-paced groups. On our first evening there, we booked a private night walk for our family. Between siblings and spouses, we filled the maximum number allowed. During dinner, the activities coordinator came to our table and explained the details. Long sleeves, sturdy shoes, meet at the trailhead at 8:30, and don't forget your signed waivers, he told us. At the next table were 2 women who'd clearly been enjoying the lodge's wine selection a little too enthusiastically. They overheard the conversation and called the coordinator over. "We want to join that walk," one of them announced loudly. He politely explained that the group was full and offered them a slot the following night instead. They pushed harder. "You can just squeeze us in," one insisted. "We won't be any trouble." "For safety reasons, I can't," he replied calmly. "There's also paperwork and a fee involved." That should have settled it, but it didn't. At 8:30 sharp, our family arrived at the trailhead, paperwork in hand. To our surprise, those same 2 women were already there, wearing headlamps and holding equipment. They were chatting casually with our assigned guide as if nothing was unusual. My stomach dropped when I realized what they'd done. "We're here for the night walk," one of them said brightly when she saw us. "We got it sorted." "You were told it was full," my brother said bluntly. The guide looked confused, glancing between us and his list. The women claimed they'd booked the tour earlier, speaking confidently enough to create doubt. The activities coordinator was nowhere to be found, and the guide clearly didn't want to escalate the situation. The women refused to step aside, insisting they were staying. Eventually, the kitchen staff had to track down the property manager to intervene. The conversation grew tense, with the women arguing loudly that they had every right to be there. Meanwhile, my mom stood quietly beside me, leaning on her walking stick and conserving energy. It was obvious she was tired, but she never complained. Because the women wouldn't leave, the property manager arranged for a second guide. The problem was that the lodge only had enough equipment prepared for one group. We ended up splitting into 2 smaller walks, each with limited gear. It wasn't ideal, but at least the walk wasn't entirely canceled. Our new guide tried his best to avoid the other group's path. Unfortunately, the jungle carries sound, and the women were not subtle. Their laughter and loud commentary echoed through the trees, and at one point we heard one of them shout, "If we don't see a jaguar, I'm demanding a refund." Wildlife, unsurprisingly, did not appear eager to accommodate that energy. We saw a few nocturnal birds and some fascinating insects, but no big cats that night. The guide quietly admitted that excessive noise can scare larger animals away. When we returned to the lodge, the property manager apologized and refunded the excursion. He assured us we'd have priority for another night walk later in the week. The 2 women were still at the bar when we got back, laughing about how they'd managed to get on the exclusive tour. They barely glanced at my mom, who was clearly exhausted from the ordeal. I was furious, but she just squeezed my hand and said, "We'll try again." That simple optimism was stronger than any anger in the room. 2 nights later, we rebooked the walk. The women had checked out that morning after receiving formal complaints about their behavior from multiple guests. The jungle felt different that night, calmer and quieter. Even the guide seemed more relaxed without the chaos trailing behind us. About 40 minutes into the walk, our guide suddenly raised his hand for silence. We switched off our headlamps and stood still in the dark. A shadow moved across the trail ahead of us, fluid and silent. Then we saw it clearly in the faint moonlight, a puma crossing the path about 30 yards away. It paused briefly, turning its head just enough for us to see its outline. My mom gripped my arm so tightly it left a mark. She was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months, pure and unfiltered joy. The cat slipped back into the trees as quietly as it had appeared. Back at the lodge, she kept replaying the moment out loud. She didn't mention the earlier drama once. The only thing that mattered to her was that puma and the fact that she'd been there to see it. Some people try to bulldoze their way into experiences they didn't earn. The jungle, however, seems to have standards. The women demanded a jaguar, laughed too loud, and got nothing. Your mom waited quietly, came back on a different night, and got a puma crossing her path in the moonlight. The jungle has its own guest list. It knew who deserved to be there. And our last story. I watched a multi-million-pound refurbishment get destroyed by a Karen. I used to manage a pub in my old city that, on paper, should have been the dream hospitality job. The building itself was a 16th century coaching inn with crooked oak beams, uneven stone floors, and fireplaces that had probably warmed travelers before modern plumbing was a concept. It had recently gone through a multi-million-pound refurbishment, and when the place was full, the atmosphere was electric. Tourists lined up for photos, locals treated it like their second living room, and for a while, everything ran exactly the way a good pub should. The problem was the owner. Let's call her Vanessa. Vanessa loved the idea of owning a historic pub. She enjoyed slow weekday afternoons when she could glide through the dining room in heels, pointing out specks of dust and talking about brand positioning. What she didn't love was the messy, chaotic human reality of a packed Friday night when the bar was 3 customers deep and the kitchen printer wouldn't stop screaming. She'd show up during quiet hours and lecture us about efficiency. "Staff costs are creeping up," she'd say, frowning at spreadsheets. "We need to tighten things." For the most part, she left me to run things day to day. I hired the team, built the rotas, trained new starters, handled suppliers, smoothed over complaints, and made sure the place actually functioned. Most of my staff were between 18 and 25. I was in my early 30s, so I became part manager, part older sibling, part crisis counselor. They worked hard. If we were slammed and someone needed to stay an extra hour, they stayed. If someone called in sick, someone else stepped up. It worked because there was trust. If you worked the hours, you got paid the hours. For nearly 5 years, that system ran smoothly. Every week, I adjusted the rota to reflect reality, late finishes, extra shifts, emergency covers, and sent the final hours to Vanessa for payroll. Then one afternoon, she called me into her office and announced I'll be handling payroll personally from now on. My stomach sank immediately. The next payday came, and within an hour, my office was full of confused staff. "I'm short," one bartender said, holding her payslip. "I stayed late twice last week." Another server was missing an entire shift she'd covered on short notice. I assumed it was a mistake, so I called Vanessa. "It's not an error," she said calmly. "If they worked outside their scheduled rota hours, that wasn't authorized. We can't keep inflating labor costs." I stared at the phone for a second. "They worked because we were busy." "The rota's the approved budget," she replied. "Anything beyond that isn't approved." That's not how pubs work. You don't tell customers to wait until Monday because the rota says the bartender's shift ended at 10. But Vanessa had decided spreadsheets mattered more than people. I had young staff crying in my office because they were short on rent. One girl told me she'd picked up extra shifts specifically to cover her electricity bill. Vanessa had essentially taken that money back. I confronted her in person the next day. "You can't refuse to pay people for hours they've already worked." She gave me the polished smile. "We have to be disciplined. If we allow overtime culture, it spirals." "It's not overtime culture," I shot back. "It's reality." She shrugged. That was when I knew I was done. Luckily, I'd already started looking elsewhere because something in my gut had told me this was coming. Within a few weeks, I had another job lined up. I was planning to leave quietly, hand over properly, and move on. Then Vanessa handed me the perfect opportunity. It was Friday night, and the pub was absolutely heaving. Every table full, the bar stacked with orders, the kitchen moving at full speed. One of those nights where everything depends on staff staying a little flexible. My assistant manager was due to relieve me halfway through the shift. They never showed up. Normally I'd stay. That's what I'd always done, but Vanessa had made her rule crystal clear: no unauthorized extra hours, no pay. So I walked around the pub and started speaking to customers. "Folks, I'm really sorry," I said evenly, "but we're closing early tonight." There were groans, of course. One regular asked, "What's going on?" "The owner doesn't pay staff for working beyond scheduled hours," I said plainly, "and we're not asking people to work for free." You could see it click for some of them. A few even nodded. We refunded meals that hadn't been served, finished what we could, and then I gathered the team. "You're done," I told them. "Clock out and go home." We locked the doors. Then I sent Vanessa a message. "Assistant manager didn't show. Since extra hours aren't authorized, I've closed the pub." My phone lit up instantly. Calls, texts, voicemails. I let them ring. The next morning, I was summoned for a disciplinary meeting. Vanessa tried to lecture me about professionalism. "You can't just close a pub mid-service," she said sharply. "I can't ask staff to work unpaid," I replied. "That's your policy." She didn't expect me to have records, but I did. Months of adjusted hours versus paid hours, screenshots, emails, notes from conversations. She went quiet when I placed the folder on her desk. That was the moment you knew the whole dynamic was about to crack. She didn't see the hours, she just saw a budget. A schedule's a guess, reality's what happens. She decided the guess mattered more than the truth. Instead of firing me, which I half expected, they put me on gardening leave, paid but not working. After a couple of weeks, they attempted to issue a warning instead, as if that would smooth it over. That's when I resigned. I didn't make a speech, I just told Vanessa exactly what I thought about cutting wages from teenagers to control costs, and how quickly she was going to destroy the place by bleeding out the people who actually made it run. Within a week of my departure, staff started leaving, one by one at first, then in groups, bartenders, servers, kitchen staff. The only one who stayed was the assistant manager, who hadn't shown up that night. Without experienced staff, the crack showed fast. Service slowed, reviews dipped, regulars drifted elsewhere. A pub built on atmosphere can't survive long without the people who create it. Last I heard, Vanessa's trying to sell the place. The once packed inn with its ancient beams and roaring fireplaces now has empty tables most evenings. Turns out you can refurbish a 16th century building for millions, but if you refuse to pay the people pouring the pints, it doesn't take long for the whole thing to come undone. Story 3 wins today. Vanessa had a multi-million-pound investment in a 16th century coaching inn, and she destroyed it to save a few £100 in wages. She didn't see that the staff were the business. The building was just a shell. When they left, the atmosphere left with them. Tourists stopped lining up for photos. Regulars stopped treating it like a second living room. A pub isn't beams and fireplaces. It's the people pouring the pints. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.